Hey, Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahushai, Ba'ashem, Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us His truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. And listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai, back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to touch on addictions, but more specifically, porn addiction, and essentially how our society, the society that we live in, is very and overly sexualized, almost to the point where it's hypersexual, right? And this is part of the condition of the battle, because we live in a society, we live in a culture that is constantly bombarded by sex, right? It's everywhere. It's in your TV, your Instagram, your social media, right? And it has a strong and detrimental effects, right? Exposing, yourself to that kind of content, you know, like for like what's the word I'm looking for? Consistently, it really does have, and it really dumbs it. Really, I don't want to say dumbs down the vibration, but it dims the vibration. That's probably the more correct way to say it, right? And really and truly, when you look at the society as a whole, it's really a ploy, it's really a tactic, it's really a measure that is put forth by the enemy to be able to make men essentially weaker, right? Because, and also it trickles down into other facets of the society where families are no longer being essentially brought forth through the natural way, where in the scriptures it refers to being fruitful and multiplying. That's not part of the agenda that's actually being pushed. What you see rather is an agenda that is basically anti-life, right? So it's become very, very normalized, where you see men being addicted to this, and essentially it leaves even women disgruntled, whether they might be single or they might be in a relationship, because the man is unable to perform, right? So I kind of wanted to floor around with this idea. I thought it would be a very interesting topic to touch on, because even myself, this is something that I struggled with, and I kind of wanted to touch on a few things, how it affected certain areas, and ultimately it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's a very it's a very powerful tactic that's used by the enemy, right? The scriptures say, "Turn thou, O Jacob, that thou mayest be illuminated," right? So one of the things that we illuminated to is to understand the way our enemy, works, right? And that's one of the things that he puts forth in the environment, is to constantly push out that vibration, right? And Esau is essentially a profane person, so your minds get so caught up and infatuated with these images, and it really it dims your vibration, right? So I guess I'll start off in so hold on, the Apocrypha. Oh, hold on. I want to floor around with a couple of topics in regards to this addiction, because this is one of the things that a lot of us suffer from. And essentially this is one of those lessons where it's very, very subjective, right? But it's also realizing that we have this truth is really about a healing process, right? And whether it might be issues within our childhood, unresolved issues from when we were young, unresolved issues with our fathers or our mothers or whoever it was, right? It's become it's an environment that that inhibits growth, right? That's really the objective of this lesson, right? So I mentioned a couple things, but I guess I'm going to start here. Forgive me, my nose is just a little bit runny. This is Sirach chapter 10. I'll start at verse 1, but the point's in 3. And it says, a wise judge would instruct his people, and the government of a prudent man is well ordered. As the judge of the people is himself, and so are his officers. And what manner of man the ruler of the city is, such are all that dwell therein. Verse 3, here's the point. An unwise king destroyeth his people, but through the prudence of them which are in authority, the city shall be inhabited. Right. So Esau is an example. He's a profane person. When you read about him in described in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, he's a profane person because these people are the type of people that own these different industries and push out this vibe. That vibration that keeps the people dim. That keeps you, locked into that mindset where you just want, just to get a little bit of pleasure, and basically the men are becoming, and it makes them weaker. It makes them weaker in a sense where they're not able to even be, essentially men anymore. Right, their social anxiety goes down. They become less productive. They become more docile. They become more manipulative. Right, and this can stretch over into other avenues too. It doesn't have to be strictly a porn addiction, but it can also go into other different facets. It could be, it could be drinking, or it could be, drugs. It could be, marijuana, so on and so forth. Right? It's essentially, Babylon is an environment that constantly breeds pleasure of self, rather than, lover of self, I should say, rather than lover of the Most High. Right? That's the type of environment that Babylon pushes forth. And Esau is very much so at the helm of that, because it's not an environment that actually brings forth life. In the ancient times, men, weren't as I don't want to say one. I could say it like this. They weren't as docile as they were. When you read about the different accounts, with our forefathers and the things that they went through, they weren't, those simple things. Whether it might be acquiring a woman, it wasn't something that was very of a challenge. Like these days you have something called, like pickup lines and so on and so forth. That wasn't a thing of the ancient times, right? You had a strict culture, and even if a man did take a woman, he would have to pay the father the 50 shekels, right? So there was more order. The women were dressed more modest. You weren't constantly bombarded with a bunch of, sexual imagery, right? Now, there's another avenue I wanted to talk about actually as well. So I want to jump to chapter 37. And I'm guessing I'm kind of touching on this. I wanted to read this also because this was something, for me, it hits a bit close to home, right? And this is just an exhortation for brothers, to essentially to improve on these areas, because a lot of the times, the reason that we entertain these behaviors is because, a lot of the times we can be bored or we can be stressed out, and it's something that's becomes very detrimental to our development. So this is Sirach. I want to read two precepts, right? So this is Sirach chapter 27, verse 37, verse 27, right? And it says, "My son, prove thy soul in thy life, and see what is evil for it, and give not that unto it. For all things are not profitable for all men, neither hath every soul pleasure in everything," right? So there are some things that are just evil for your development, and it's not, as opposed to something that is supports your development. porn is one of those things that's detrimental to our development, because what does it do? It not only does it affect you, and it can affect your ability to perform, within the ministry, right? It can also affect other avenues of your life. Like, say, for example, if you're a man and you have a woman, what does that do? It affects your performance, within the bedroom, right? When the scriptures talk about a man, essentially he has humbled her. When you read in Deuteronomy the 22nd chapter, that becomes a lot more difficult, with this particular addiction, right? It also affects women as well, because the women, they're not, they don't get the satisfaction, and so on and so forth, right? Because I've seen clips of women, they might have been with a man, that has that particular addiction, and they are not essentially being humbled, so to speak. And it's a very, and when you go even further, like the point I was making earlier, it's a measure that's very anti-life, because if he's not able to perform, then that union is disrupted, and the man can be fruitful and multiply, right? I'm not saying we're in a time to be fruitful and multiplying, right? But the point really is that it's an agenda and it's a ploy, by Esau, to essentially destroy the masculinity out of men, and to be able to disrupt families. It disrupts the culture, and it disrupts the nation, right? So it's just a bad measure, for a society that's prosperous, because the scriptures talk about how the knowledge of wickedness is not wisdom, because he doesn't implement the ways of the Heavenly Father, and Esau is not that type of person, right? So let me get another precept as well, because I mentioned another point, because sometimes one of the reasons we feel these urges is because sometimes also sometimes we're stressed out, or we're bored, right? And I'm very much guilty of this, right? So this is going back into Sirach 33. I'll start at verse 26. Actually, I'll start at verse 25. And it says, "If thou set thy servant to labor, thou shalt find rest. But if thou let him go idle, he shall seek liberty. A yoke and a collar do bow the neck, so are tortures." Excuse me. "So are tortures for an evil servant. Send him to labor, that he be not idle. For idleness teacheth much evil. Set him to work, as is fit for him. If he be not obedient, put on more heavy fetters." Right? So, the point is that idleness, we have a saying in the Caribbean, the idle mind is a devil's workshop, right? So that's why it's so, productive. It's so aiding and so helpful to be productive, to utilize your gift, to be able to have time, away, and being able to do something, where you're essentially you're engaged in the spirit, So for example, like I myself, I probably would go to, I have a tendency to go to the library a lot, right? Because that helps me to, be more in tune with the scriptures, right? To be able to sow more to the spirit rather than sowing more to the flesh, right? So, and like I just said, if the shoe fits, wear it, right? Because, you may not be the type of brother that actually wants to do that, but the point is to be, is to constantly be productive, constantly be, engaged in something that is actually going to aid to your self-development, rather than aiding and sowing things that's for your detriment. Right, hold on, let me get that, since I mentioned the word sow. So hold on. Is it Galatians? This is Galatians 6 and 8, and it says, "For he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." Right? So, you want to be in you want to have a type of surroundings that helps to sow more to the Spirit as opposed to sowing more to the flesh, because it leads you in, this type of addiction. It really dims your vibration to the point where you're not able to perform, in the way that you would, right? So think about it like this. If you're driving, like, think about those drivers that drive those NASCAR races, right? They're driving, they need to be able to have a car that is very optimal. It's up to date. The tires are, there's tread on the tires, the brakes work good, they essentially the mechanics of the vehicle is able to perform. It's able to hit the sharp corners, it's able to accelerate, the gas pedal works, there's the engine, there's oil in the engine. Like, think about it as yourself. Like, if you, and then I'm kind of equating this in the spirit also, we are those vehicles. So why would you put something detrimental in that vehicle that's causing you to lose, that's causing you to slow down, that's actually causing you to dim your vibration, to be able to dim your performance? You want to be able to give yourself things that's actually going to alleviate and strengthen your performance, right? So, that's really the point, because a lot of the times why a lot of, men, for example, they get caught up with these addictions because it's simply out of boredom, right? So it's always good. It's extremely, helpful to constantly stay productive, whether it's, studies, or, you have a hobby, you have some type of, something that keeps you engaged and it keeps your mind occupied, so I wanted to read this actually as well, and I guess I'll end off. This is an account here. Is it Mark 5? Give me 1 second. This is Mark chapter 5, verse 25, and it says, "And a certain woman had an issue of blood 12 years, and suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. And when she had heard of Yahushua, came in the press behind, and touched his garment. For she said, If I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Yahushua immediately, knowing himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, Who touched my clothes? And the disciples said unto him, Thou seest a multitude thronging thee, so people pushing him, back and forth, right? And he said, and sayest thou, who touched me? And it says, verse 32, and he looked round about to see her that had done this thing. But this woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. And he said unto her, Daughter, that faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague. Right? So I want to get that word whole, because ultimately all these different things that we suffer from, it makes us, it's broken. And that's the point of the objective of this, is to understand that we need a physician. It says whole in the etymology, it says entire, whole, unhurt, uninjured, safe, healthy, healed, sound, genuine, straightforward, undamaged. Oh, look at this. It says salvation, right? So we need a physician to make us more whole, because this body, we have faults. This body has flaws. This body is corruptible. The scriptures say that the corruptible body, it presseth down the soul, and it weigheth down the mind, that museth upon many things, right? So you are in an environment that is essentially, it's essentially pleasure island. There's pleasure this, and there's this pleasure and that pleasure, and there's this to do and that to do. The flesh is always bombarded by all these different pleasures, right? So, we need a savior. We need a savior to be able to make us more whole, because this body it reaps of death and corruption. We take care of it, right? We take care of our our abode, our temple, but understanding that this, coupled with the way the Esau's devices, right? The scriptures say also, we're not ignorant of his Satan's devices. So also, this is also a device that affects a lot of us as young men in this culture, in this society. Continuing on in whole in the etymology here. Let's see if there's any more. It says health, remedy, cure. Let's see. Condition of being unbroken. And it says completeness. So essentially, through Yahushua, we are being made complete, right? Just like this woman was being healed to try and touch his garment, the hopeful light on like that woman that is, constantly trying to hold on to that garment, to try and, because, the scriptures say that, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way, to the healing of thy word, to roughly paraphrase, right? So these words are able to take demons off of us, kind of like how David, he was able to play the music, and it took those demons off of Saul, because it was an evil spirit troubling him, right? So oh, the last here, it says below here, it says of a sound mind, right? So that's pretty much the point. I kind of wanted to read these things, to actually bring a sense of comfort, but to also understand that, it's one of the devices of Esau, and it's also a portion of self-development, right? Understanding that this culture is so heavily sexualized, and why the Lord has to shorten the days, because it's just becoming a place that's unlivable. It's becoming uninhabitable. Things are not growing. Things are actually regressing in this society, right? As a matter of fact, I guess I'll end off with that in 2nd Ezra. Where is that? Where is that? 2nd Ezra. 2nd Ezra 14, verse 17, and it says, For look how much the world shall be weaker through age, so much more shall evils increase upon them that dwell therein. So this is a world that, constantly pushes forth this vibration, and this is not a healthy vibration for men's development, right? This is not a healthy vibration, that actually brings forth life, because they think what men are exposed to, that type of imagery, that type of videos, is edification, because then they use smooth words, you know, to pass it off as something that is actually helpful, or it's sex education, you know. These crackpots, like this woman that got arrested, what's her name again, Bonnie Blue. They pass it off as sex education, right? There's a process, there's an order, to sex, right? But this is what happens when you have a wicked person, not an upright person, a person who is not upright in rulership, right? So this is the fruits thereof, right? This is the works, this is the deeds. So I'll leave the lesson there, but I sincerely pray and hope that this lesson was edifying, as some kind of comfort, right? This is something you can overcome, right? I'd just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.